Welcome back to the Naughty Corner. We'll start with a reminder of where we left off in the timeline last episode before continuing with a summary layout of the second half of the day's events. As we covered last week, between 2:40pm to 3:10pm, one police team begins clearing Parliament grounds using skirmish lines, pepper spray and fire extinguishers. They clear the area immediately inside Parliament's main gate by 3:04pm. A second police team advances down Molesworth Street through heavy opposition, including objects thrown and petrol sprayed at them. They clear the area outside the gate by 3:07pm. An LRAD is moved to the Parliament forecourt and continues issuing warnings as it had earlier in the day. 3:15 to 3:30pm, police clash with protesters in front of the main gate but manage to advance, while others advance on the main camp area inside Parliament ground and begin clearing tents and property. Then carrying on from there, the events we'll cover this episode. At 3:39pm, protesters light the first fire and throw objects at officers to prevent them from accessing the fire zone. 3:40pm, police use both LRADs to briefly broadcast an aversion tone directed at the protesters throwing fuel on the fire. This is what many identified as sonic weaponry. The FENZ, Fire and Emergency New Zealand, also turned up at this time. And I assume they had a crew on site, otherwise they turned up within 1 minute. Our firefighters are good, but not that good. 3:47, FENZ had 2 hoses on the fire. 3:49, most protesters have been driven off the lawn. 3:51, the slide and playground area have become engulfed in flame due to another act of arson by protesters. 4:07, the fires have been extinguished. At 4:20pm, the police line on Molesworth Street advances past Kate Shepherd Place, reaches the High Court, and then continues to push on towards Lambton Quay. Meanwhile, police in Parliament grounds push protesters down to the Lambton Quay gate but struggle to close it due to a deluge of items being thrown at them. At the same time, protesters light another fire at the base of a tree outside the Lambton Quay gate and heap tinder upon it. 4:27, a team leader requests deployment of the Urgent Action Team after a protester is seen with a lit Molotov cocktail. 4:29, FENZ arrive at the Lambton Quay gate with a fire hose but refuse the police's request to turn it on protesters. 4:30, more structures are set alight at the gate in Cenotaph. 4:40, protesters attempt to set fire to the old government buildings opposite Parliament but are foiled by security staff. 4:45, police use the fire hose firstly on the protester who, according to the report, has been carrying a lit Molotov cocktail for about 20 minutes at this point, then on other protesters. 4:51, the Lambton Quay gate is shut and secured. At 5pm, protesters attempt to light another fire by the Cenotaph but FENZ extinguish it. At 5:24, protesters start throwing tuna bombs at police, which are explosive devices used for fishing and could certainly do some damage. 5:30, protesters start focusing their efforts on the less protectively equipped group of officers standing across the intersection of Lambton Quay and Bowen Street. Their intermittent use of the LRAD's aversion tone is focused here to deter the projectile-throwing protesters. 5:42, police authorise use of sponge rounds. 5:47, police are forced to retreat as a protester picks up a fire hose, turning it on the police as they fall back. 5:48, 3 police officers retaliate in kind by throwing paving bricks at protesters, and the 1st STG team arrives to deploy sponge rounds. By 5:50pm, the protesters' use of paving bricks and tuna bombs is outclassed by police sponge rounds, and the blue line quickly advances up Lambton towards the bus terminal. At 6 o'clock, a car is reversed into the police line. Officers break the passenger window, but it drives away with sponge rounds being fired at the rear windscreen. The police Molesworth Street and Lambton Quay pushers meet up and create a circular formation. Again, a fire hose is turned on protesters. Meanwhile, they light a skip on fire and break Victoria University's glass entryway. 6:30pm, 20 officers form a skirmish line and move down Bunny Street to Featherston as protesters start to disperse. This dispersal continues until the early hours of the following morning. Given all the violence and mayhem going on, how many complaints did the authority receive regarding this half of the day? How much outcry did this chaos generate? They did not receive any complaints of injuries to protesters due to police using fire hoses on the 2nd of March. However, they received 4 complaints from the public about police's use of the fire hoses, in which the general sentiment was that firefighting equipment should not be used in police operations. 2 officers reported that they threw paving bricks at protesters at the intersection of Lambton Quay and Bowen Street. These incidents were captured on the video footage reviewed. Despite that, the authority did not receive any complaints about injuries received by protesters that were caused by police throwing paving bricks. They received 3 complaints from people who were struck with a sponge round on the 2nd of March. They also spoke with 3 others who wished only to provide their accounts to inform the review, 2 of whom were treated at Wellington Hospital for injuries sustained after being hit with a sponge round. Well, here we go, 3 complaints. Were they from hooligans upset the police had ruined their fun by literally breaking out the big guns? The report itself clarifies as follows. Their footage review identified that some people struck with sponge rounds, including those they spoke to, were not being aggressive or throwing items at police, but were standing in close proximity with those who were. They concluded that most, if not all of these people were hit unintentionally by police officers firing the sponge rounds, which missed their intended target or ricocheted off the target or another surface. This clearly tells us something which is obvious once considered, but that the report never addresses. There were no complaints filed for the most extreme uses of force employed by the New Zealand police during the Convoy 2020 protest. No complaints regarding people having pavers thrown at them, none for fire hoses aimed at them, and none for being shot by sponge rounds, except for a few instances where they weren't the intended target. What I'm getting at is that almost 2,000 complaints were received regarding police conduct during the protest as a whole, but effectively none were received for these most violent of interactions. That's because the latter involves people who were themselves violently engaging with the police, and so in the eyes of everyone got what they deserved. By contrast, the landslide of complaints received about police during the protest was because violence was being employed against those who were protesting peacefully and not deserving of such brutal treatment. The report talks at length about the events in the second half of the 2nd of March, laying out a case to justify the use of sponge rounds and weapons of opportunity. Yet if they receive no complaints about such things, one has to wonder why. If I'm honest, it seems like a red herring, and that brings up something else I haven't mentioned previously. While 225 pages long, you're 74 pages in before you even get to the section of the report discussing February the 10th. There are screeds of text detailing background information to set the scene, discussions of police tactics, police engagement with other parties, measurements taken to ensure protection for officers both physically and mentally. There's frustratingly little discussion of actual police conduct throughout the entire report until this point where the conduct of officers which was not complained about is discussed at length. We're informed in paragraph 712 that some officers told the authority that the operation had negatively affected their well-being and mental health, and a significant number became visibly distressed during their interviews 6 months or more after the riot. Firstly, it's nice that the officers got to have in-person interviews. That wasn't an offer extended to those that had complained about them. Secondly, we're never told what part of the 2nd of March operation these officers were referring to as having disturbed them. Was it early on when they were ordered to assault the peacefully assembled, or later when both sides were fully engaged in violence? In order to steelman the position of the police and the IPCA, I'll assume the latter. We desperately need good police in this country, now more than ever, and I'm sure the righteous and unenviable work of dealing with genuine troublemakers on the 2nd of March 2022 must have been taxing. The last thing I'll say regarding the later half of that day is that further down the road a number of those troublemakers were identified, as the report details in paragraph 865. In the months following the 2nd of March, police investigated more serious offences committed during the protest, gathering evidence from CCTV footage, police photographs and other sources. These offences included arson, endangering by reckless disregard, riotous damage, assault with and possessing of offensive weapons. Of this group, police initially identified 200 people who should be charged in addition to the initial arrests, but this figure was reduced to about 54 people after considering police resources, court constraints and a wish to avoid a perception of payback. Cases are ongoing before the courts. What's most interesting about this is that both the police and the IPCA seem to treat this as a separate group of people from the protesters at large. These 54, or about 54, whatever that means, are never lumped in with the 95 that police arrested on the day. No mention is made of people being arrested late in the afternoon or evening on the 2nd of March, nor does the report have any discussion or give any details regarding the breakdown of the charges against these 54-ish individuals as it did regarding the charges laid against protesters on the 10th of February. It's odd that the report seems to treat this group as a completely separate entity when since the day itself many of the pro-protesters side has claimed the troublemakers of late day 2nd of March were not members of the protest but separate antagonists. It is conjecture but makes sense. After all, why would protesters light their own belongings on fire, or the belongings of those they've been camped alongside for almost a month? Most would assume they'd be able to reclaim their belongings after being evicted, which brings us to our next topic, property disposal. Excluding complaints about vehicles, the IPCA received 9 personal property complaints from directly affected people about property seizures on the 2nd of March. They're not specifically investigating these complaints individually as they're addressed in the report generally. There are laws in place regarding property seizure. Under Section 164 of the Local Government Act 2002 requires certain notices be given to the offenders. Police had to follow the post-seizure process, including giving identifiable property owners a warning and reasonable opportunity to comply. Property seized under that power must also be returned to the legal possessor of it. None of these requirements were met. However, police say they were not relying on Section 164. They took the view that the property left behind had been abandoned by the owners and therefore liable to seizure and destruction. It may be arguable whether all of the property could be properly regarded as abandoned, but the IPCA accepted that police had no other option. When the occupation ended on the 2nd of March, approximately 10 truckloads of goods of various descriptions gathered from the parliamentary precinct and surrounding areas were taken to a site in Porirua. Some property was also taken directly to the landfill. Those inquiring of their property were told they could attend the site to retrieve their goods. Some tried but were refused entry. Ultimately, the material was condemned by health officials as unsanitary and a health risk and dumped. As mentioned, some property was taken directly to the landfill, as the report confirms again in the following. During the day, the 2nd of March, security officers were asked by an unknown police officer to tell the truck drivers not to deliver any more goods to the police evidence store at Prosser Street and to ask the drivers to take the property straight to the landfill. The general confusion about how seized property was to be dealt with was in evidence later in the morning of the 2nd of March when, acting on a request from the police, Wellington City Council personnel called Fulton Hogan asking them to provide what equipment they could to start clearing out the rubbish. The following day, police requested the General Manager of Regional Public Health to strongly consider some sort of health order to enable destruction, which we could carry out. Regional Public Health did so and determined the items might constitute a nuisance under Section 29 of the Health Act 1956. This required an inspection by an Environment Health Officer employed by the relevant council. Ultimately, an Environment Health Officer and a Health Officer met with police at the facility to inspect the pile of items. Police informed the Environment Health Officer of the concerns the property was contaminated with rubbish and waste, including rotten hay contaminated with human waste, and backed this up with photographs not shown in the report. Concerns were also raised about COVID-19. The Environment Health Officer inspected the property and determined it was sufficiently contaminated to be considered unsafe for people to pick through and retrieve their belongings. On that basis, the property was ultimately dumped at the landfill. In relation to Victoria University and the cathedral where a number of protesters were camped, it appears that the initial police view was that any protester property on their land was their responsibility and the police would not take responsibility for it. While Section 165 of the Local Government Act 2002 allows enforcement officers to apply to an issuing officer to issue a warrant authorising them to enter private land premises and seize and impound property that is being used in the commission of an offence, police are not designated as enforcement officers under that section. However, despite their earlier indication of lack of legal authority to clear property from private property such as the cathedral, police did. They later said it became necessary to seize that property to suppress the riot and for safety purposes. How tearing desperate people's tents out of the ground would suppress their urge to riot is left unexplained. The intention of the diocese was to have police clear the cathedral front lawns and Molesworth Street area and remove that property to the Porira site for individuals to reclaim should they wish. The cathedral would clear the tents from their back lawn and find a location outside its premises where people could come to reclaim their belongings. Whether there was specific authority given to police by the diocese prior to the removal is unclear, but certainly that was the intention, as the diocese had taken legal advice to allow police to do the clearance. It's interesting that they received legal advice suddenly at this point rather than earlier as soon as people started erecting tents on their property. That little sentence alone reeks of police pressure, but the report never goes into any detail on it. The report concludes its assessment of property destruction in the following paragraphs. Police properly understood that property on private land was the responsibility of the owners of the land and essentially a civil matter, and that police had no powers to enter and seize a protester's personal property from private land without a warrant or a removal order under Section 216 of the Local Government Act 2002. Yet property was removed by police from private property without warrant or order. The police decision to use the Health Act as a justification for the disposal of the property seems to have been done hastily and almost as an afterthought. While the lawful justifications for police to seize and damage property might sometimes have been tenuous, the IPCA do not consider any prosecution against police for willful damage for the destruction of protesters' personal belongings would succeed. That seems like an odd thing to say, almost like saying, while the police action may have been unlawful, they doubt our current justice system would do anything about it. Speaking of the justice system, the report then turns to recommending the expansion of legal powers in paragraph 933 as follows. We note, however, that the legal powers which exist to seize property are not fit for the purpose of dealing with an occupation of this nature, especially given A, the use of force required to clear the occupation area and restore the protest to a lawful state, and B, the fact Section 164 does not cover privately owned/occupied land. Again, we think that consideration should be given to the development of a more specific and comprehensive legislative framework for these types of public order events. Despite unlawful property removal without a warrant, tenuous justification for property destruction, and hasty decision-making, a few paragraphs earlier the report declares all these actions reasonable, saying, whatever the basis for it, we think the actions police took in respect to property in the aftermath of the riot were reasonable. Protesters have been given adequate time to leave the public spaces and take their belongings with them. Some did, those that did not must have realised that the escalating situation put their belongings at peril, yet they abandoned them. The potential use of property as either weapons or fuel for the arson activity was a real and identifiable risk. Moreover, to have left the property where it was would have presented an incentive for protesters to return to take up occupation again or to retrieve their property. I'm not sure what adequate time people were given because, as we discussed last episode, police started clashing with protesters immediately, before actually issuing them trespass in some instances, if not simultaneous to doing so. Yet the report bangs on about protesters abandoning their belongings as if they were under no duress at all. The concept of respectfully moving items to another location appears almost impossible, as if for some reason the New Zealand taxpayer can pay for a helicopter to hover overhead all day, but getting the Parliament groundskeeper and some recruits to carefully pull up pegs and fold tents would be out of the question. Regardless, that's all for this episode. Join us next time as we wrap up our assessment of the IPCA report by looking at their conclusions and drawing our own on how well they executed this undertaking.